I've lived in Sarasota for about 40 years, which is most of my life. So I was not born and raised here, but I feel like I was. My dad was in the military. That was his first profession, 24 years in the Army. So I grew up an Army brat and we moved all around. But Sarasota was always home base because that's where family was. And then when he retired, this is where we moved and been here ever since. So if we have any veterans out there, first responders, thank you for your service because it's really important and you deserve that recognition. You're welcome. I mean it sincerely. In addition to being essentially from Sarasota, though, I originally worked in the environmental field for about 6 years, actually with Sarasota County, doing environmental permitting and inspections, and then I felt like I really wasn't meeting my calling. My grandmother, unfortunately, had multiple strokes in her older years, and I saw her go through therapy, and I saw her work with physical therapists, and I thought, that's it. That's what I want to do. That's my profession. So I went back to school. I was married and had my son in school at the time, but went back to school to become a PT, which I did in 2006. And then I did that, and I worked mostly inpatient rehab, acute inpatient rehab, like if you go to Encompass or Sarasota Memorial and they have their in-hospital rehab. I did that, and my expertise doing that for 4 years was people with head injury, traumatic brain injuries and things like that, but also worked a lot with just neurologic things in general, people with stroke and Parkinson's, MS, all kinds of things. So from there, so I was doing that for 10 years. And I had a friend who was an occupational therapist, and she had been doing driving evaluations ever since I knew her, and she was looking to retire. So she asked me if I had any interest in taking over her position with Sarasota Memorial, because she said, I think you would be great. Do you have any interest? And I said, yeah, maybe, because I like to do lots of different things. I don't like to do the same thing all day, every day. So I like variety. So this brings a lot of variety. So I've been doing this now. I've been doing it since 2016, doing medical driving evaluations for Sarasota Memorial Hospital. Yeah. And during that time, my dad was diagnosed with Parkinsonism. So I've worked with lots of people as a PT with Parkinson's and Parkinsonism, but also I have that personal experience with my dad. So, and this presentation is specifically about driving, and he did have to retire from driving at 77 because of how he was being impacted by the Parkinsonism. So that affected me a lot with working with people about their driving. When you work with physical therapy and you're trying to get people back to their functional independence and their walking, that's really important to them. So I was just honored to work with them on that, but then also to work with people on their driving. Those are like the two most important things to most people, at least in our culture. So anyway, so now I've been doing the driving for 9 years with Sarasota Memorial, but I decided to start my own company, Medical Driving Solutions. And when I resigned my position at Sarasota Memorial, they decided to let their program go. So they were the only people in Southwest Florida doing driving evaluations, medical driving evaluations. And so like within an hour and a half radius in any direction. So now that's me. But I say all of that just to kind of explain where I came from, what my background is, what my expertise is, and that's my perspective when I'm looking out and working with people. And fortunately, Sarasota, Bradenton, Southwest Florida still has me in this location because there's only about 12 or 15 or so in this entire state. So that doesn't make sometimes finding an evaluator very easy for people. So I have a couple of presentations that I made. So they're brand new to me. I'm not exactly how long it's gonna take me to go through them. But, and I'll try not to go too slow. And I'm gonna also try not to read everything that's on the screen, because I don't like it when people do that. It just seems kind of boring. But that's what this presentation is about. It's about medical driving evaluations and the decision-making involved in that, and also what my company has to offer and what a medical driving evaluation in general has to offer. So we'll just proceed. So, and I'm sure we're going to review some things you guys already know, but hopefully also have you learn some new things as well. But key topics, obviously the driving laws in Florida and certified medical driving evaluations, the decision-making associated with that, as I said. And then also there's lots of options out there actually for trying to return to driving, or sometimes adapting your driving with adaptive equipment if you have some kind of physical limitation or impairment that prevents you from driving, quote unquote, the normal way, or the able-bodied person way. And also we can look at ways of restricting a person's driving, and also there's retiring from driving. We don't always talk about that, but that is an option, to just retire from driving sometimes. And that's something that is a personal decision. But a lot of times people don't really consider it an option, and we really don't plan for it, which is kind of unfortunate and ironic, because we do plan to retire from our professions in general. You're not going to be doing your work profession your whole life. And in general, that's true with driving too, especially because people are living so long. And as you age, even normal, healthy aging, you have a slowing down mentally, a slowing down physically, and then also impairments that come with the eyes. And those are the three things that's the trifecta for making you a risky driver, is slowing down or having impairments to those three areas. So I would encourage you, if you are still driving or you have a family member still driving, to start considering, it may be eventually that I need to stop. I may not want to stop, but maybe I should stop because my abilities have become too risky or too impaired to warrant the risky task of continuing to try to drive. So obviously it's important to know what the laws are. The vision requirements for Florida are, you have to have, this is the easy answer, you have to have at least 20/40 vision in one eye. You can drive with worse if you see an eye specialist or an eye doctor who's willing to do special testing with you and fill out a special form for the Department of Motor Vehicles saying that your vision is legal and safe to drive. But all of that ends up being more complicated jargon. So the easy answer is at least 20/40 in one eye, you're good to go. If it's less than that, you can pursue seeing an eye specialist. And then the other vision requirement that's legal is peripheral vision. The Department of Motor Vehicles calls it horizontal field of view. Horizontal field of view is wide, right? So peripheral vision, you need at least 130 degrees of continuous, meaning no holes. So 180 degrees is a line from here to here. And then right off your nose, that could be maybe 25 or 35 degrees there. So 35, 35, and then you go 55, and then maybe 75, and then way out here would be 90. So if you're looking at, you could have 130 with both eyes, but it has to be continuous with no gaps. So if you have some kind of vision problem that means that you have a gap or something blocking the vision in the middle that could prevent you from driving. You could have one eye and still be able to have 130 because your singular eye could still come from here all the way to here, your nose, but then across your nose a little bit. So that's why some people, even though if you're blind in one eye or you only have a singular eye, you can still be safe to drive. But in point of fact, if that were your case, people are safer drivers if they've been dealing with that situation for many years, as opposed to if you're used to driving with two eyes for binary vision and then all of a sudden you lose vision in one eye. Now this is a new scenario that might be risky, is definitely risky for you, and it can take some accommodating. So that would be a different thing to look at if you had a new impairment like that. But those are the vision requirements for Florida: 20/40 in one eye at least, and unless improved by an eye doctor, and 130 minimum horizontal field of view, peripheral vision. There is medical reporting that goes on. That's true in any state across the country. And there's also driving restrictions that can be considered, like not driving at night, for example. And some of those are legal things that get put on your driver's license in certain states, but not all states have the same. And so that's something to keep in mind with our state, is that although there is a legal restriction they can put on your driver's license for daylight driving only, there's not something like within a 5-mile radius of your home or with your local and familiar routes. So when the state of Florida Department of Motor Vehicles is looking at you for driving, and you have your driver's license, which is valid and legal, in your pocket, they expect you to be able to drive in all areas safely, including the interstate. And that's important just to point out, because there are some times when a person gets reported to the State Department of Motor Vehicles, officially, legally reported. And if they get your name and somebody tells them, I'm concerned about Terry, and she has Parkinson's, and I'm not sure she should be driving, then the State Department of Motor Vehicles is now legally required to follow up with you and see if that's true or not. So there's certain laws for Florida for driving where you, obviously your driver's license has to be renewed every so many years, right? Every 5 years or whatever. So that's one way to get renewed. If you go in, you physically go into the Department of Motor Vehicles here locally, and you say, I want to update my driver's license because it's getting ready to expire. The people that work there are observing you, and they're allowed to ask you questions if they're concerned about you mentally or physically. And if they say to you, you know, I see that you're tremoring, or I see that you had some difficulty, you know, walking up to the counter here, is there something, you have a neurologic problem? And most people are very honest and just say, yeah, I have Parkinson's. And as soon as you say that, they have your name, they have a legitimate reason to put you under a legal medical review for your driving privilege. And the staff at the local DMVs are instructed to look out for these kinds of things. Sometimes they tell you nicely, sometimes it's kind of harsh, depending on who it is. But regardless, they can do that. So they can put a hold on your license until you get reviewed medically, and that would sometimes send you to a person like me. So, so when you are flying under the radar, and they do not have your name, they do not know that you have a medical condition of concern, you are legally allowed to make the decisions about your driving, like where you drive and when and how much. But once they have your name, then you're under their rules and laws, and they can force you to undergo testing under threat of revoking your driving privilege. So that's a legal medical review process that the state of Florida has. All states have it, but there's varying degrees of requirements that are associated with it. So like in some states, if you have Parkinson's, you would be required to report yourself or your family member. In our state, it's not like that. Our state does not have mandatory reporting. So even though you have Parkinson's, you are not required legally to tell the Department of Motor Vehicles. I do have an attorney that I work with on legal questions, and I did send him a question just for clarification, because the one thing I'm not sure of is if you go into the local Department of Motor Vehicles and they ask you if you have Parkinson's, are you legally required to say yes if you have it? Or can you decline to answer, or can you say something else? You know, if they put the question to you, you might be obligated to be honest about it. But if you just have it, you don't have to volunteer it. So, so the state of Florida laws are very lenient. Some of you may know this, but in our state, no one is required to get retested for their driving ever. Not at any age or interval, which I think is pretty shocking and not very prudent, but that's how it is. At 80 years old, if you're 80 years old and older, and you're updating your license for some reason, they're required to check your vision, but that's it. No checking of your driving knowledge or your practical skills behind the wheel. So this also probably explains to you why our roads is as crazy as they are. Because people forget it's a privilege and a responsibility and not a right. And so people continue to drive forever. A lot of people do, most people do, it seems like, and they're unwilling to give it up, and we know why, because it affects your independence. And we're very independent people as Americans. And our culture also is very, it's built on automobiles too. And, you know, that's how the main way we get around, because we're not a big city like New York City where we have, you know, the subways and stuff like that. So, but it is improving. I'll say that there's a lot of improvements to the alternative ways of getting around. So that is a good thing. This means that unless a person decides to retire from driving on their own, most people just continue to drive, you know, unfortunately, and sometimes until a really bad accident happens. And then we hear about that on the news, and we hear that, you know, this is a person who's 95 years old and has severe Alzheimer's, and, you know, they drove into a group of bicyclists and people are killed. And then everybody says, well, why is this happening? Well, because we don't retest people in general, and because people are really reluctant to give up the driving without good alternative methods of getting around. And sometimes too, you have physicians who are not being responsible and talking to people about the importance of, you know, your age, your medical diagnosis. This is now making your driving too risky for you and for others. So that's a good conversation for physicians to have, or medical professionals in general to have with their patients. But also it's important for family members and friends, you know. And I had that tough, really hard conversation with my dad, and at 77, and asked him to stop driving, and that's young for some people, but for him, unfortunately, and his cognition was still intact, his thinking skills, but he was just so slow. The thinking was really slow, the physical movement was really slow, and those two things coupled together made him a very slow driver, and he was an obstacle for everyone else who was around him on the road. And the whole family saw it. So that's my mom, my husband, my brother, his wife, but my dad didn't see it. And that's the hard thing too about Parkinson's, is that sometimes the progression, since it can happen so slowly from day to day, you don't realize how much you've changed. It's like I've been married for 23 years, and I keep looking at myself in the mirror. I'm like, yeah, I look pretty good. But then I go back and look at my wedding photos from over 20 years ago, and I didn't have gray hair, and I was thinner and fitter. But then you see, when you look back, you can see the big difference, but you don't see it from day to day. So what I find with people, and it's not just people with Parkinson's, but a lot of times it is, just lose the ability to have good insight into what your true abilities are in the current state. Because this change is happening to you so slowly, you feel pretty normal. But if you look back to when you were more capable, that will give you more of a true indication as to where you currently are. And I encourage people, if you're a family member, to talk to your person, your family member who has the diagnosis, but I also encourage the people with the diagnosis to talk to the family members, because if you can't rely on your own brain to tell you the truth about what's happening with you, if you have supportive medical professionals, if you have a support system like this where you are at Parkinson's Place, if you have supportive family, then you can rely on them to give you honest information that's in your best interest. That's not always easy to hear, though, because that's like how it was with my dad, And initially, he was resistant to stopping driving, but he did think about it for a couple of days, and he did agree to retire from driving with no testing. So that's the thing, you can just have a conversation. It's hard to talk about, but doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. And in that case, you can save time, money, and frustration. And you don't have to deal with the Department of Motor Vehicles and any kind of medical driving evaluation like this. But this comes into play if you are under medical review legally by the state. The first thing that they ask for is your complete medical history from the doctor most familiar with your case. So your personal health information, all of it gets written on paper and sent up to Tallahassee for them to review. And they have a group at the medical advisory board that reviews it, and there's some physicians in charge of it. But so physician to physician, they talk about your case on paper, and that's how they decide whether or not you should be allowed to continue to drive or not. Sometimes when you take that notice to your doctor and you say, I got this letter from the state, they're going to take away my driving privilege unless you fill out this information for me and send it back. So sometimes the doctor will say, sure. And oh, by the way, it also asks the doctor, the very last part is, what is your opinion? Should the person be allowed to drive or not in your professional judgment? And so all the information they put about your medical history and that part about do you think they're safe to drive or not is critically important in making the decision. So I urge people to try and find out what the doctor wrote before he sends it or she sends it. So sometimes the doctor will say, I'm not going to fill that out for you. And they can say that. They have the right to make their own professional judgment whether or not to do it. So, and in that case, you're just forced to try and find another physician that's familiar with you to fill it out for you. Because if you do not get your medical history to them within 45 days of the notice, your license is automatically revoked. So that's how they get people to respond, is that they threaten to revoke the license legally. And you can't contest it. There's an appeal process, and you can try to get an attorney, or you can come see a person like me and try and demonstrate that you can do things safely. So I'm sorry, what did he say? Mm-hmm. A physician assistant or a nurse practitioner? It says specifically physician, most familiar with your case, and it's a complete and total medical history. So the optician or optometrist or ophthalmologist, they could do the vision part, but they couldn't do the rest of it. Usually it's a neurologist or the primary care doctor who does it. It specifically says physician too. Nurse practitioner is not on there, or PA, physician assistant, is not on there. So I would find out if they would accept that before having that sent. But even if it was a nurse practitioner or a PA, they work under a physician. So that should be, if the physician is in agreement, that should be okay. Is there a question?
Yeah, just to add to that, I was a physician in Pennsylvania, and they have a law that the doctor, she sees things like seizures, dementia, and dementia, that we have the obligation to put that patient.
Yep.
There was a form. The patients often got angry at me. I didn't like that
Right.
first. Then I would come back and tell them, I don't have a choice.
Right. Right. Right.
And if I don't, and you have an accident,
Right.
they can come back at me,
Right.
I could be liable.
Right. Right. And so you were a physician in Pennsylvania? So he's saying, I don't know if everyone heard him, but he was a practicing physician in Pennsylvania. And up there, they were essentially mandated to report people if you had seizure or serious medical issues in order to preserve your license and protect yourself from liability lawsuits. So, and physicians, they are liable. Our physicians in Florida have the same concerns, I would say, but it's not mandated in Florida. That's the difference. And so they have to be careful because since it's not mandated in our state, if they don't go about it the right way, it could be perceived as a HIPAA violation.
With the families being involved. Sometimes I don't think they can tell how you drive just by how you're eating, walking.
Right.
So they don't always have the usual expertise if they actually haven't learned to drive. I was diagnosed about 19 years ago, and my daughter, not my ex, said, I can't drive you. Okay, grandchildren.
Right.
But I was just diagnosed
Right.
very early,
Yep. Right.
just for hearing that term.
Right. Yep.
That automatic,
Right.
19 years later.
Yeah. Yeah, it's tough. There's so much emotion around trying to continue to drive when you're getting older, but it's not just age. I say to everyone, age is not an automatic disqualifier, but it is a relevant factor. So we can't not pay attention to that. Because as I mentioned, even healthy aging indicates a slowing. And that with a fast, dynamic, complex task like driving, any slowing is of concern. And, but yeah, and a lot of people are familiar with Parkinson's or maybe different forms of dementia. So when they hear that, you might have family members like him who maybe you feel like jumped the gun a little bit on their opinions about you and your driving. And so, but it's important to talk those things out as best as you can. And also, you know, you could always, I tell people, if you're concerned about your person's driving, go with them. Be the passenger in the car and go with them and see how they're doing. Don't just make, well, you can have an opinion without doing that, and maybe they don't feel safe and comfortable doing that. But it is an option to also observe the action, you know, with the individual and start in a safe, low intensity place, like a mostly vacant parking lot. And that could be a way to reassure. And then you work your way up to the more complex things. That would maybe possibly be a way to reassure family members who are concerned. But if you get placed, and a lot of people with Parkinson's do get placed under medical review with our state simply because it's Parkinson's and it's more visible. It's a more visible disease process, whereas dementia is invisible. You can't always tell that a person's, you know, unless you spend enough time with them, talking to them, you don't always know that they're impaired because they're very good at covering sometimes their impairments. But Parkinson's presents with some physical impairments, a certain posture, a certain gait, a slowness, and also sometimes a tremor, which can be very evident. And so there's lots of people who go to update their driver's license and they get observed, and because of the Parkinson's being visible, and that's how they get placed under medical review. So it's actually a little unfair, I think, because the problem is the people with dementia fall through the cracks and they get just to continue driving. But in our state, it is a legal requirement. If you have active seizures, you're legally not allowed to drive, and that is the one thing that doctors have to report on. But then if you've been under the care of a physician for at least 6 months with medication and you haven't had any seizures, then you can try to return to driving at that point. But that's the only thing in our state. And the physicians they're not mandated to report in our state. And you're not mandated to report yourself, but if you get asked at the DMV, you may be obligated legally, since they're trying to issue you a government license to drive on government roads. So if the doctor sends your report up to the Tallahassee and they review it, sometimes they send another letter asking for more information if they don't feel like they have enough to make their decision. Sometimes that second letter is get a certified medical driving evaluation done with a certified person, and that would be me. Yeah, and then again, there's only 12 or 15 at any one time in the state. It fluctuates a little bit, but so, and then you have sometimes a hard time getting in a timely fashion, but lucky for you guys, I'm here. But so I get probably half the people that way from the Department of Motor Vehicles. The other half I get, well, let's say the other 40% I get because the doctor refers. So sometimes the doctor refers just because he has a concern. Sometimes he's got the medical forms from the DMV to fill out for you. And he says, or she says, I'm not going to fill these out for you and send them until you get evaluated first. And then they'll use my evaluation to answer the question of, do you think this person is still safe to drive or not? And then they can kind of cover themselves and not have to answer that part. So I get probably 40% of the people that way. And then another 10% are just people who they're not under review by the state. They're not being referred by their doctor. It's just them or their family with their own personal concerns. And so they just look for a place where they can get evaluated and then get referred to me. So getting back to this, I haven't gone through many of my slides, but I'm hitting on some of the most important parts for you guys though, because like I said, I do get many people with Parkinson's get selected for the medical review process. And if you're a mild case, you're more likely to be able to pass everything and continue to drive. But as things progress, that's when it becomes a little bit more iffy. But obviously, if you're not complying with the Florida laws, you could have legal penalties, accident liability, and increased safety risk. And this is where we talk about the certified medical driving evaluations. There's about 40 people or so in the state who do medical driving evaluations, but again, only 12 to 15 at any one time seem to have certifications. And so you just need to know that, because if you're under medical review, it has to be a certified person. So you would look for that specific designation of the CDRS. But just like any therapy, we evaluate you, and if rehabilitation is appropriate, we do that. We make a plan for improvement if that's possible. We make recommendations for moving forward. What's included in a certified medical driving evaluation? Well, the first part is just to get your medical history, and then also talk about your driving history. Not necessarily how you drove 60, 40, or even 20 years ago, though. It's really like the last 5 years. Because you could have been a stellar driver 60 years ago, but that doesn't mean you still are today. So we have to look at more current status to make those current decisions. So it starts with a medical history review and driving review, and then there's physical assessing that goes on, physical and cognitive assessments. So the physical assessment is easy since I'm a PT. So it's just a very basic, what's your mobility like, your range of motion, strength, coordination, sensation. If you have a history of falling though, that's one of those things that is an indication of more impairment coming and less ability to self-correct and right yourself before you fall. So they have studies that indicate that if you have a history of falls, you're at like 30 or 40% increased risk of car crashes. So the physical assessment, I explained. The vision, I'm not an eye doctor, so I have a special machine to test for vision. And it's way better than what they have at the local Department of Motor Vehicles. But it is very fancy. But that's how I test for vision. And we can do some things beyond just what the 2 vision requirements are if we want to and need to. And then the cognitive assessments. This is a very important part. A lot of people don't pass their medical driving evaluation because their cognition is poor. So each person who is a CDRS uses a selection of cognitive tests. But just like with the medical association, there's standards and expectations with physicians and what they do in certain cases. It's the same with being a CDRS. So you may go to a different CDRS if you want maybe more than one opinion, and their tests may be slightly different, but it should be pretty close. Because in order for it to be certified, it has to have certain things. And so when you work with me, right now my cognitive assessments are 7 tests. 1 is a traffic sign test. So that's the one test that looks at traffic knowledge. And then the other 6 tests are actually medically based tests. Medically created, medically researched, medically validated over the years. So the medical community, the Department of Motor Vehicle community, the rehab community for driving, all consider these tests to be valid at testing what we want them to get at. So that's the ones that we're encouraged to use. And what they're testing for, though, is things like visual scanning, because that's an important skill for driving. Can you visually scan with your eyes and find the important information that you need? Visual perception skills and visual spatial skills, that's obviously very important for driving. Attention, this is huge. Your ability to pay attention and more importantly, your ability to attend to more than one thing at a time. So your ability to mentally multitask, and that's what we call it in the medical community, divided attention. So driving is 100% of the time, anytime you're behind the wheel, is divided attention. We also look at problem solving, memory, things like that. but they're medical tests, so they have thresholds that we want people to meet to demonstrate that they're competent and capable. And 4 of the tests are actually timed with a stopwatch. And this brings in the fact that driving is a fast task. So they want you to be accurate, but they also want you to be a quick, efficient thinker. So some of the tests you can do poorly on because you make too many errors, but you could get them all right and do poorly because it took you too long to find the correct answer. Yes, sir.
How does Tallahassee save us from the 14-year-old whose family is allowed to drive?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean,
Throw 'em in jail. How about?
that's a good question.
Yes, from a school principal who is arrested for driving while impaired,
Oh, yeah.
in possession of cocaine. How will we protect her from that person?
Well, hopefully they get caught by the police. Yeah, I mean, but you make a relevant point. It's not just older people and people with Parkinson's that are the risky drivers. And that's something I discuss with my clients all the time, is that it's really the youngest drivers and the oldest drivers that the data shows. I don't make it up. The data shows they're the high-risk drivers. They have the most accidents and the most injuries. And I work with people too. I mean, given that we're in Sarasota County and the population that's here, most people I work with are older, but I work with a lot of people also 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, because you have early onset Alzheimer's. People have strokes, they have traumatic head injuries, or they get spinal cord injuries, they get amputations from being overseas, or they have peripheral neuropathy and have amputations. So that's kind of the fun part too about working with people on driving, is that you get a whole cross-section of age groups and diagnoses. So, but your point is well taken. There's a lot of people out there doing a lot of crazy stuff, and a lot of them getting away with it, which is not right, but it's happening. So the indoor part of the testing is all the things that I mentioned. And then if the person performs adequately on those things, then you essentially earn the privilege of doing a behind the wheel test. And that's where I get in the car with the person and we actually do road testing. And I have my own vehicle with a passenger side safety brake that we use for that. And that's the same thing we did at the hospital. There's also adaptive equipment. So like I said, some people have amputation, they can't use, or they had a stroke and now they can't use their right foot anymore. So there's adaptive equipment. There's a left foot accelerator, there's hand controls, there's special handles and knobs for steering. So with technology, you know, they've invented equipment to help people transition to driving a new way. And that's another thing I do. If that's appropriate for you, I can make that prescription for this special equipment, and then you can order that. I can evaluate you on it, get you competent, and then you can order it, have it installed in your own vehicle, and then you can do a test with the local DMV, and they add that to your driver's license to allow you to legally drive with adaptive equipment, if that's something that's appropriate for you. So the gold standard for testing driving is always going to be that road test, because nothing compares. Not even the, as good as they are, nothing compares to the, like, even a simulator doesn't do justice to the actual task of driving. So the evaluations help to identify risks and capabilities, and then that can help us make better decisions when it comes to what's appropriate for your driving. If a person is not under medical review by the state, then we have the freedom and flexibility to make our own choices about your driving if you're willing to do that. Because sometimes, like my mom, she's 84, she's still a driver, but she doesn't drive all over tarnation. She doesn't go to places, I grew up in the South. She doesn't drive to places she's not familiar with. She doesn't drive out of state, you know, so she's safe to drive from our house to some of her doctors and our house to Publix, that kind of thing. So, but since she's not under medical review, we and her can make those decisions together. And she feels comfortable with that, and I feel comfortable with that. So if you have that kind of system, you don't have to do all this formal evaluating. This helps a lot when you're under medical review by the state and you're trying to prove you're still safe. This can help you keep your driving privilege longer if you pass it all and get medically endorsed for that. But then in that case, if you're under medical review by then, like I said, your license allows you to go anywhere. So they want you to be able to demonstrate you can drive anywhere. So they want me to test people through parking lot, light, moderate, heavy traffic, and interstate. And sometimes we can say no to the interstate if the person's not doing it ever again, like they don't want to, and they don't, and they promise, cross their heart, hope to die that they won't. Then sometimes we can still get that through. But they want you to demonstrate a high level of competency on a road test. And that means that the road test is also not like 5 minutes, it's at least a half an hour. And it goes into 45 minutes, sometimes an hour or longer. And if you're training on equipment, then that's even more. Sometimes you need more than one session to learn that new thing. So it comes down to also, is the person comfortable and confident? Because if you're comfortable and confident, you're going to be a safer driver. Hopefully. If I'm working with you and you're demonstrating the skill set successfully, I also want you to be comfortable and confident. But so as I said, we look at the physical readiness, the cognitive readiness, the visual, but then also I add in parentheses, I'm also, the whole time I'm working with someone, I'm assessing, do they understand what their limitations are? Like really? Are they accurate about that? So what's their insight, their safety awareness, their what's their behavior like? Are they understanding and remembering what I'm trying to teach them? Are they responding appropriately to me emotionally, behaviorally? Because we have sometimes issues like that, which can prevent a person from being able to drive. So if you're a very impulsive person and doing things unsafely, or if you're unable to keep your behavior and emotions in check, then I have to not endorse that person because they wouldn't be safe behind the wheel. So, and then I encourage, collaborating with family, other medical professionals that you have a good relationship with and a trusting relationship with. That seems to end up with the best outcome. And then that's my company. And then just talks again about you do have options to try to return to driving if you've had surgery or you had, God forbid, a stroke or something like that. If you need adaptive equipment, or if you feel like you just need to restrict your driving in certain ways. Like a lot of times people just stop driving at night because they're just not interested in going out at night anymore. It's just not something they care to do. Or not driving in the rain or not driving during rush hour. Lots of options. Yeah, adjusting driving times, modifying driving times, vehicle modifications. You can even add extra mirrors, wider mirrors. There's lots of options. And then planning for driving retirement. And again, part of what I instruct when I work with people is what are the alternative methods of transportation in our area. And with things like Uber and Lyft, it is a lot easier to get around. But also Sarasota County instituted the on-demand service. So if you see the Breeze vehicles, it used to be SCAT, Sarasota County Area Transit. Now it's called the Breeze. But they have an on-demand service, which is kind of like a county Uber. But it's a small multi-passenger vehicle, so a small SUV or a small van, and it will take people around. You call, set up your ride. I've heard people have good experience with that. It's $2 per person per ride, So that's one of the most economical ways you're going to find. But that is just to keep you in your local spot. That's not to take you long distance from the end of the county to the end of the county, or from Sarasota County to Manatee County. But there's another service called Senior Transport Services, and this is a nonprofit driving group, and they pick you up in a regular car. And since they're nonprofit and they use a lot of volunteers, they're also a more economical way of getting around, and it's non-institutional. It's just a regular car, just like a taxi or Uber, and they will take you all over Sarasota County and Manatee County. So, and there's others, but those are the best ones to mention right now. And that's just another part of what I try to help people with, is just making decisions that they're comfortable with, that hopefully their family and their physician are comfortable with, and making equipment recommendations, helping them, connecting them to services as much as possible. You know, for some people, moving to a senior living community is a good option. You know, some people do very well in a place like that, and you have some transportation, some basic transportation is included as part of your rent. But some people don't care for that at all. But I've worked in all the settings you can do as a physical therapist: home health, outpatient, acute hospital, all the rehabs. I worked in a lot of assisted and independent living facilities, memory care, skilled nursing facilities. And the bottom line is, it's going to cost a lot no matter what you do. You're either going to stay in your home and you're going to pay to have the care come to you, or you're going to move somewhere else and pay a lot to have that care in that senior living community. None of it's cheap. Actually, the ideal solution, if you're blessed with family who's supportive and you can come to some kind of mutual agreement, the best kind of scenario is when you have like multi-generations helping each other. So like when my mom was my dad's primary caregiver with Parkinson's, and that became just too much for one individual to be able to do. And so my parents, my husband and I, we decided to combine forces and move in together. That's not for everybody, but that worked out for us. And, you know, but keeping that allowed us to keep my dad in the home until he went to heaven. And that gave him the best quality of life. It was still expensive, and we still had to have some help coming in, but it was probably the least expensive route to go. That's the ideal kind of scenario. So I think I went over all of that already, and I'm just gonna switch over here if I can, because I made two for you guys. One was more of the basic, all the basic information, but this one has some specific stuff associated with Parkinson's. And obviously some of this stuff you guys are already going to know, but some of the main things. We know that Parkinson's affects motor. That's your muscles, your ability to move. Tremors, rigidity, slowed movements. These are all things that increase your risk with driving. And cognitive challenges too, impairing attention, problem solving. And obviously the disease progression, the onset is variable, and then the progression is variable. Some is very slow, some is very quick. So we just have to take each case as it is and evaluate that person for what their scenario is. But if you're slowing down in your regular functional mobility, you can pretty much correlate that to also slow driving. They have research to back that up. So as hard as that is to hear and think about. Yeah, so things that require coordination and quick thinking become unsafe as symptoms worsen. And obviously that makes your risk greater of hurting yourself or someone else. And then you also have the potential risk of being sued. And if you I hate to say it, but the truth is we live in a very litigious society. And if you get sued, they can subpoena your medical records and they can see that you have Parkinson's, and I'm sure that would be used against you in a court of law. So it's important to talk with your family and make team decisions about what you think is appropriate for driving. Because if you get sued, and you're retired, that's your financial nest egg for the rest of your life. So you want to kind of look at a cost-benefit ratio. How much benefit are we getting from the amount of risk that we're putting out there with trying to continue to drive? And I know even people who are able-bodied and younger, the driving is crazy out here. Every single time I'm behind the wheel, I feel like I'm almost in an accident these days, and I'm seeing accidents every single day. So it just gets harder as you accumulate more medical problems and also get older. So tremors can make it more difficult for you to have smooth steering and precise vehicle control. Rigidity is really a difficult thing because it can affect your ability to brake effectively and quickly, but also with your forward flex posture and your rigid posture, that means your rotational ability diminishes, and that means you have less ability to look and turn to see your blind spots and the areas behind you when you're looking to merge or make a lane change or even drive in reverse out of a parking space. And again, slow movements is really a major, slow thinking, slow movements coupled together create a lot of safety risk with your driving, delayed reaction time, affecting all the driving activities. But it's also important to think about sleep. Sleep is huge, and your moods and how that varies can affect your driving. And, going back to the cognitive impairment, some people, it is not uncommon for a person to have Parkinson's and then also have the onset of cognitive impairment as well. Not everybody, but some do. It's not unusual at all. And then it's also important to think about your medication. Not only are you going to have an on and an off time if you're doing the Sinemet kind of thing, but also that medication can have side effects that are negative, that can cause drowsiness or dizziness. So these are all things that you want to be aware of and certainly don't want to be driving when that's happening. Lots of things to take into consideration though. Slowed reaction times, impaired judgment and safety risks, impaired vision, whether that's through just regular aging or some other issue. Having difficulty with the multitasking is a key element of being unsafe. I see it a lot with people who, and a lot of us, we either drive alone or sometimes our spouse doesn't want to become the primary driver, or sometimes they're daydreaming, or sometimes my husband's always been the primary driver and he's a great driver. And sometimes even the spouse can't fully see how far the individual has become impaired. So that's the benefit of having a third person professional point of view come in and give a more objective viewpoint as to how the person's doing. And what I find is that I find people they see something of concern, like a kid with a ball, so they've quite appropriately are focused on that and trying to avoid getting too close to that. But then in the meantime, they've run a stop sign and they didn't even know it. So that's the kind of thing with divided attention and mental multitasking. When the driving is the most dangerous, complex thing we try to do. And there's so much you have to take in so fast, and it's three-dimensional, and it never stops. And and you just miss something, and that could be it. Of course, that's true with able-bodied people too, but your risk increases as your impairments increase. And that would come out also if you had an accident and you were sued. And then with navigation, a lot of people are starting to use their GPSs if they're having difficulty getting around using their own brain strength, or even relying on a spouse to help them know where to turn or where to go. But technically speaking, if you're relying on something or someone to be your co-pilot to help you do the task effectively, then that means that you yourself are not a safe and independent driver. And that's really what the driver's license is covering you for, is saying that you're a safe and independent driver. You shouldn't require a second person or the GPS. And even if you rely on the GPS, that can be wrong or that can fail if you don't have a good signal or your battery or whatever, something shorts out. So, and that's why we see the gray alerts, silver alerts posted a lot. These are missing older people in their cars. And police are looking for them, trying to make sure they don't get injured or lost. And sometimes people end up in a different state, or sometimes, you could be taken advantage of if you're trying to find your way back, and, somebody who with negative intentions can take advantage of that. But, so I think I pretty much touched on all this. Increased risk of accidents and near misses. And then again, that's why the medical driving evaluation can come into play. Yeah, so I think I also pretty much addressed this too. So I just urge you to think about all of these issues, the legal, the ethical issues. We can't all do what we've always done forever. Things just change, and, we have to be smart about the decisions that we're making. But I encourage people to have a collaborative approach so that you're getting the opinions of people you trust and who have your best interest at heart. And that is the conclusion. I'll also just add really quick, if you give me just maybe 2 minutes. When my dad agreed to stop driving, my mom became the primary driver. And after that was going on for a while, he complained to me, your mom is driving like Mario Andretti. I'm like, what? I'm like, this is news to me. Okay, well, I'm like, you have to investigate this, So, I talked to my mom and I talked to him. I said, Dad, is she driving over the speed limit? And he thought for a second and he said no. So my dad, with his Parkinsonism, since he had become so slow, and that was his new normal, and that's what he was comfortable with, so he needed more time to take things in. So when she's driving not over the speed limit, though, he felt it was very fast. He perceived it as fast, but she wasn't actually driving like Mario Andretti. But this is how Parkinson's and things like that can skew your perception of reality, which is what makes you a risky driver if you don't understand how slow you are, but also I don't know. Yeah, that your perception can change. And it's hard to recognize that until something like that happens. I think that was actually a really helpful thing to happen for all of us, because we were able to see where he was at, and then he was able to admit, yeah, she's actually driving safe. It's just me. But then I did ask my mom, try to slow down a little bit so he doesn't feel. Yeah. But so I know I went a little bit over. I apologize. Any questions? Last minute questions?